I never thought my life would lead me here, standing in front of Graven Hollow Psychiatric Ward with a badge clipped to my chest and a laminated card of rules in my pocket that felt heavier than the building's stone walls. But here I was, Kent Armitage, 32 years old, on my first official night as an orderly in a place that had whispered its way through every dark corner of town gossip. The place sat on a hill like some old beast that had died and never decayed. The original stonework blackened with moss and time, new steel glass wings jutting out like unnatural bones someone had bolted on after the fact. And as I stood at the entrance, I couldn't help but feel like the whole structure leaned forward to watch me, judging whether I'd make it out when morning came. I told myself it was just nerves, just a job, but even the air around the ward felt heavy, too still, as that the night itself was holding its breath. And when the doors opened with a hiss, I was greeted by Nurse Hallie, the kind of woman who looked like she'd been here longer than the paint on the walls, her movements steady and deliberate, her eyes unreadable, as if she carried a secret rhythm no one else could hear. She handed me the laminated card and said, "You'll hear things. Pretend they're pipes." I almost laughed, but something in her tone stopped me. I glanced down at the card and read the 6 rules printed in bold red, and the words made less sense the longer I stared. Rule 1. After 2:13 a.m., do not speak any patient's name aloud. Rule 2. If you hear the intercom whisper your name, respond only with, "All accounted for," and keep moving. Rule 3. Room E7's door must never be fully closed. If latched, open it the width of your thumb. Rule 4. During silence, cover all reflective surfaces. Rule 5. Deliver the meal tray for bed 5 outside the door, knock twice, and never look in. Rule 6. End of shift, deposit your badge in the salt tray. If it turns pink, remain inside until day staff arrives. Each line felt less like a workplace guideline and more like instructions for surviving a haunting. And I remember thinking that maybe this was a sick joke the veterans played on rookies. But Holly's face carried no trace of humor, only a grim certainty that made my stomach knot. She led me through the halls, the scent of antiseptic mixed with something metallic, and I realized the silence wasn't complete. The building hummed faintly, like a throat clearing itself in anticipation, and as we walked, patients pressed against reinforced glass, their eyes following us like silent predators. One woman tapping her forehead to the glass with mechanical rhythm, a man mouthing words backward, his lips moving in some reverse prayer, and a boy no older than 19 holding his hands out as though he could warm them on the flickering fluorescent bulbs. "You'll be with me tonight," Hallie said, her voice flat. "Rounds at midnight, meds at 1, silence begins at 2. And the way she emphasized that word made my skin prickle, capital letters spoken out loud, like silence wasn't an absence of noise, but a presence that demanded respect. I tried to swallow the unease by asking what exactly happened if we broke one of the rules, but she just tapped the laminated card and said, "Learn them by heart, then learn them again," as though the repetition might one day save me. As we passed deeper into the sub-level corridors, I noticed the cameras on the ceilings twitching as if trying to focus, always leaving a blind spot where we walked. And in that blind spot, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck lift like static. "If you feel like you're being watched," Hallie said suddenly, her words sharp enough to cut the air, "you are. That's fine. It's when you feel like you're not being watched that you should worry." And the way she left it hanging made me glance into every shadow, half expecting someone or something to be standing just behind us. I wanted to laugh it off, to call it paranoia, but the truth was I already felt it. The building wasn't just stone and wires. It was aware, and it didn't like strangers. When we stopped at a door marked Wing E, sublevel, Hallie pressed her badge to the reader and the lock gave a reluctant click, as though it hated the idea of letting us in. And she turned to me with a look that was almost pity, before saying, "This is where the rules matter most." And as the door swung open, a draft of cold air brushed my face like the breath of something waiting in the dark. I should have walked away right then, but instead I followed her, down, each step echoing louder than the last, carrying me deeper into a place that already knew my name.
They didn't waste much time breaking me in, because on my second night, Hallie made me stand in the staff room and recite the 6 rules out loud, word for word, like a prayer said to a god you don't understand but hope is listening anyway. And the longer I spoke them, the more I realized how strange they really sounded in my own voice, like spells stitched into sentences. And when I stumbled on Rule 3, the one about room E7's door never being fully closed, Hallie's eyes cut toward me so sharp I felt it in my ribs. "The width of your thumb," she reminded, holding her own hand up as demonstration, not wider, not tighter. And I nodded like a child, repeating back a lesson without daring to ask why. But inside, I was crawling with questions, wondering what could possibly happen if a door was latched too tight or left yawning open, and wondering why a psychiatric ward would care about thumb-width precision at all. I asked about bed 5, the ceremonial tray left outside the door that no one touched, and Hallie didn't answer, just slipped a folded muslin cloth into my palm and told me I'd understand soon enough, that every new hire did eventually. And when I pressed her again, she said, "It's not about feeding the patient, Kent. It's about feeding the agreement." Words that burrowed under my skin and stayed there, wriggling, because agreements are made between people and something else, and I had no idea what the else was in this place. That night, our rounds began in Ward C, and I carried the tray balanced on my hands, soup sloshing with every step. And when we reached bed 5's door, Hallie knocked twice with knuckles that didn't shake, while my fingers trembled so bad I nearly dropped the bowl. And then we walked away without looking back, though curiosity clawed at me until my neck almost twisted of its own accord. And just as we reached the next corridor, I heard the scrape of porcelain being dragged across tile behind us, the sound of the tray sliding inside the room, though the door never opened. And when I glanced at Hallie for confirmation, she simply said, "Rule 5, complete," as if we'd just filed paperwork instead of left food for something we weren't allowed to see. A few minutes later, we passed room E7, and I swear the door had been pushed nearly shut, the latch hovering one hair away from locking, and Hallie jabbed her thumb between the frame and wood until the gap opened to the proper width, muttering something under her breath like a chant. And in that brief moment, I leaned close enough to hear what waited inside, a soft humming, off-key and childish, drifting through the narrow slit, a sound so faint I thought at first it might be air in the vents, but no vent sings like that. And the more I listened, the more I swore it was calling for someone, a name I couldn't quite catch. "Move," Hallie snapped, pulling me away before the tune could finish. And as we walked, she added, "Curiosity's a disease here. Don't let it eat you," though her own hands were shaking just enough for me to notice. Later, while covering the observation mirrors in sub-level E for silence, I pulled the muslin cloth over the largest one and caught my reflection not moving in time with me, its mouth shaping words my ears couldn't hear. And for a heartbeat, I thought the glass was showing me the future or a version of myself already lost inside. And I nearly froze there until Hallie yanked the cloth down, covering it fully, whispering, "Never give them the mirror." And though I wanted to ask who "them" was, I already knew I didn't want the answer. Silence itself arrived like a tide at 2 a.m., sudden and heavy, swallowing every footstep, every breath, until even our thoughts seemed too loud. And somewhere down the hall, wheels squeaked as if a gurney was being pushed with no one behind it. And when instinct made me turn my head, Hallie's grip tightened on my arm, forcing me to face the wall, her lips brushing my ear as she hissed, "All accounted for." And I echoed her, even though my heart wanted to confess, to say, "No, something's missing. Something's walking these halls that doesn't belong." When the half hour passed, the silence lifted like a weight thrown off our chests, and the ward returned to its usual hum. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the building itself had been listening to us, waiting for one of us to slip and say the wrong word. And I think that was the moment I finally understood these rules weren't suggestions, they weren't superstitions, they were bargains written in red. And if I wanted to survive here, I would need to follow them even when every inch of me burned to break them. By my third night, the ward had already started to feel like a living thing. Its walls exhaling stale breath, its floors pulsing faintly under my boots like veins carrying some slow current. And I realized that rounds weren't just about checking doors and counting patients, they were a ritual, a choreography to keep something vast and unseen satisfied. And as Hallie led me down the first corridor, she spoke less, letting me carry the silence like a weight, while I tried to remember every line of the rules taped in my pocket. The intercom crackled suddenly and whispered my name, not Kent, but Kenny, the nickname my mother had used when I was a boy, a name I hadn't heard in years, and the sound slid through me like a knife coated in honey, sweet and cutting all at once, and before I even thought, my lips parted to answer, but the memory of Rule 2 slammed into me, and I forced out the words, "All accounted for." Though my voice cracked like a teenager's, and Hallie gave me a sideways glance that could have meant approval or suspicion, I couldn't tell which. As we turned into Ward B, I saw a patient pressed to the glass, a man whose wrists were covered in yarn bracelets instead of restraints, his hands smeared with marker symbols I didn't recognize, and when his eyes locked on mine, he mouthed my name in perfect rhythm with the intercom, fogging the glass with each syllable. And my body screamed to acknowledge him, to prove I was seen, but Rule 1 gnawed at me, never speak a patient's name after 2:13, and the clock on the wall had just struck 2:14. So instead, I pressed my palm flat against the glass with my name scrawled in ink, showing him the letters like a shield, and he leaned back, satisfied as though I'd given him food. Minutes later, we reached bed 5, and I laid the tray on the floor with hands that shook so violently, soup slopped over the edge, burning the skin between my thumb and forefinger. And when I knocked twice and turned away, I swore I heard something wet and deliberate slurping behind the door. The kind of sound a mouth makes when it's not human and not pretending to be. Hallie didn't comment, just scribbled something in her pocket notebook, her handwriting tight and slanted like someone trying to trap words before they escaped. At room E7, the door gaped wider than a thumb, nearly 2 inches, and the cold air rushing out smelled faintly of sulfur and apples, an impossible combination that made my stomach flip. And when I reached to adjust it, Hallie hissed, "Gentle, never slam it." So I pressed carefully until the gap narrowed to my thumb's width, and as I did, a sound like humming drifted out, tuneless, warped like a child's bedtime song sung underwater, and I couldn't help leaning closer, my ear brushing the wood, catching fragments of a name that might have been mine or might have been someone else's, and my curiosity clawed at me to know the rest, but Hallie's fingers dug into my shoulder and yanked me back hard, whispering, "If you hear it finish, it'll own the ending." And her grip shook enough that I finally believed she was afraid. When we reached the observation mirrors in sub-level E, I draped the muslin across one and caught a glimpse of myself smiling when my own mouth wasn't, teeth flashing too wide and too long before the cloth covered the glass, and I staggered back, bile rising in my throat, but Hallie simply nodded, as though this was routine, whispering, "Never trust a mirror that gives you more than you asked for." Words that sink into me with all the weight of another unspoken rule. Silence began at 2 on the dot, the vent slowing to a crawl until the air felt stale enough to chew, and I thought I'd prepared myself for the unnatural hush, but nothing can prepare you for the way it presses on your skull, amplifies your heartbeat until it sounds like someone else is knocking inside your chest. And halfway through the half hour, I heard wheels squeaking, the unmistakable roll of a gurney approaching, only this time there were no footsteps, no shadows, just the sound closing in, closer and closer, until instinct made me glance over my shoulder, but Hallie shoved me against the wall, her breath hot in my ear, whispering, "Don't look, let it pass." And I forced myself to stare at the floor while the wheels brushed my sleeve, the air colder than ice as it passed, and the smell that clung to me afterward was burnt hair and copper. When silence finally ended, I was drenched in sweat, trembling from the effort of not moving, not speaking, not disobeying. And as Hallie checked the last muslin cover, she muttered, "Good, you're learning when to keep your eyes shut." And though she said it like praise, the words chilled me worse than anything I'd seen, because in a place like Graven Hollow, keeping your eyes shut might not be about safety. It might be about survival. By the 4th night, I stopped trying to convince myself that Graven Hollow was just a job, because the ward didn't let you hold on to normal explanations for long. It stripped them away like peeling skin, and by then I'd memorized the rules well enough to recite them in my sleep. But knowing them didn't make me feel safer. It made me realize how fragile the line was between routine and catastrophe. And that night, the weight of that knowledge pressed harder than ever as Hallie and I prepared for silence. Draping the muslin cloths over the mirrors, my hands trembling with each cover, half afraid I'd see something before the glass went dark. The building itself seemed to anticipate the moment. the vents slowing, the fluorescent lights dimming until every corner looked deeper than it should. And I swear the temperature dropped a full 10 degrees in less than a minute, as though the whole place inhaled and froze the air inside its lungs. I finished covering the last reflective surface when the intercom let out a hiss that sounded like it was clearing its throat, and then silence fell. Not the natural quiet of a library or midnight street, but a deliberate, suffocating stillness that crawled into your ears and clogged them. So absolute that even my thoughts felt like they were echoing, and Hallie gave me one sharp nod, reminding me without words, speak only if the intercom calls, nothing else. At first, all I heard was my own heartbeat, frantic, uneven, like it was begging me to bolt. But then came the squeak of wheels again, closer this time, dragging slowly across the tile like a gurney being pushed by invisible hands. And every instinct screamed at me to look, to confirm I wasn't insane, but I pressed myself to the wall and kept my eyes fixed on the floor, remembering Rule 5's cruel sibling truth. If you see the wrong thing during silence, it sees you back. The wheels passed by, brushing the air against my arm, and for a second the cold pressed into my skin so deeply I thought it might leave a bruise. But what chilled me most wasn't the touch. It was the whisper I swore I heard hovering above the wheels, faint and desperate. Hungry. A single word, too human and too broken, and I nearly gasped out loud, but Hallie's nails dug into my wrist like claws, anchoring me to the rule. And we stood there until the sound faded, leaving only the sickly hum of lights that weren't really on. We moved cautiously after that, checking E7's door, which stood thumb-width open, perfectly measured as if someone or something had adjusted it themselves. And Hallie frowned, whispering so faintly I almost didn't catch it, "It listens better than it used to." And I wanted to ask what she meant, but just then the intercom crackled with static and whispered my name, soft and low, like my mother again, like she was calling me home for dinner. And the pull in my chest was so strong I almost forgot the response, but at the last second I croaked out, "All accounted for," and the static hissed once, displeased before cutting off. I couldn't stop thinking about the tray outside bed 5 either, how we'd left it an hour before, and when we passed the door again I saw the bowl licked clean, the apple slices stacked into a single impossible wedge, like a puzzle completed by unseen hands. And as I crouched to pick up the spoon, it rolled under the door frame and then rolled back out, the handle marked with a fresh notch like a bite, and my blood went ice cold. Something inside had teeth, and it wanted me to know. We reached the staff lounge just as the silence lifted, vents roaring back to life as though the building was exhaling in relief, and for a moment I felt like we'd survived another night by sheer chance. But before I could sit, Hallie handed me her notebook, a page folded back, and on it were scrawled dozens of dates and times, each marked with one word: missing. The entries stretching back years, names scratched out and replaced with titles: orderly, nurse, patient, visitor, always crossed out, always rewritten, as if speaking them would give them permanence they didn't deserve. And when I looked up at her in horror, she simply said, "That's why you never call them by name." Her voice flat, drained, resigned. I wanted to argue, to tell her that names were just words, that they couldn't erase people, but when I tried, the intercom hummed faintly, like a predator clearing its throat, and I shut my mouth before it could ask me to prove otherwise. That night, when my shift ended, I dropped my badge into the salt tray, and for the first time, the crystals turned faintly pink, just a blush, and Hallie said quietly, "Stay." So I did, sitting in the break room until dawn leaked gray through the narrow windows, and all I could think about was how the rules weren't keeping the ward's darkness away. They were feeding it just enough to keep it patient. And patience is the scariest hunger of all.
By the 5th night, Graven Hollow had already begun to wear me thin, like the ward was slowly filing down every sharp edge of my mind until I fit neatly into its rituals. But what rattled me most was walking into the staff lounge and finding Hallie's name wiped from the whiteboard, replaced with 2 bland words: family emergency, scrawled in dry erase, and the look on Miro's face when he erased those words without comment told me everything. You didn't announce absences here. You didn't acknowledge them at all, because the ward had a way of listening and a way of keeping what it liked. And so that night I was paired with Miro, a man whose eyes never seemed to focus where you expected, as if he trained himself not to look directly at anything that wanted attention too badly. He recited the rules with me in a low, gravelly voice, almost a chant. And when the intercom whispered my name again, this time stretching it into a sound like fabric tearing, I barely got the words "all accounted for" past my lips before it hissed, softer now, as if amused, but then it said another name, Hallie's, rising at the end like a question. And something in me cracked because the sound of her name spoken inside that static made my gut clench with dread, and I wanted to answer, to call her back. But Miro's stare froze me and I choked out the line instead, lying to the building, lying to myself. We carried the ceremonial tray to bed 5, and before I even bent down to place it, the door trembled against its frame, vibrating like a beast pawing at the other side, and Miro hissed for me to hurry. So I dropped the bowl and apple slices, knocked twice, and backed away without daring to blink. And the moment my back turned, I heard the soup slosh once, then silence, as if swallowed in one long gulp. At room E7, the door wasn't just ajar, it was latched shut, fully sealed, something that should never happen. And the sight of it made my stomach lurch, because it meant someone had either ignored the rule or something inside wanted the latch to click. And Miro shoved his thumb hard against the gap until it sprang open a sliver, muttering, "Don't think about what passed through." But his face had gone pale and slick with sweat, and I couldn't stop imagining what could have forced its way into the ward through that polite little gap. Deeper in sublevel E, one of the patients tapped the observation glass with a long yellowed nail in a precise rhythm. Tap, wait, tap, tap, wait. And I felt my own fingers twitch to answer it, like the rhythm itself was a question begging for completion. But Miro gripped my arm and whispered, "That's how you end up writing new rules." And the way he said it made me realize the laminated card in my pocket wasn't complete, that there were other rules born from mistakes no one dared admit aloud. During silence, as the building exhaled its breathless hush, I felt a pressure in my chest like a hand pushing down from inside. And then the wheels came, squeaking closer and closer until I was sure they would stop directly in front of me. And when they did, the air grew so cold my breath frosted in the beam of my flashlight, and a faint voice rose above the silence. Not mine, not Miro's, but Hallie's, whispering something I couldn't make out. And for one reckless second, I almost called her name, but instead I whispered, "Charge Nurse," the title I'd written on the blank line of my card, and the wheels rolled past as if satisfied, leaving only the reek of copper and smoke. When silence ended, I let myself breathe again, but I couldn't shake the image of Hallie's voice trapped inside whatever pushed that gurney. Later, as we checked the last corridor, I spotted a small black square of muslin folded on the ground near E7, heavier than cloth had any right to be. And when I picked it up, faint letters appeared across the fabric, as though stitched by frost. "Don't close the mouth." And before I could ask what it meant, Miro slapped it from my hands, his voice sharp. No extras, inventory notices. But his eyes betrayed him, wide and hollow like he'd seen the same words before. At shift's end, I slid my badge into the salt tray and the crystals flushed a bright, undeniable pink, fizzing like soda. And though my hands shook, Miro didn't hesitate, just said flatly, "Stay." So I did. Sitting in the break room until the sun crawled over the horizon, and all I could think was that Hallie hadn't left for any family emergency. She'd been claimed, folded into the ward like salt dissolving into water. And if I wasn't careful, my name would be next on Miro's list of the missing.
By the 6th night, curiosity had its hooks in me deeper than fear, and though every nerve in my body told me to follow the rules and keep my head down, I couldn't stop circling back to E7. That door left open just a thumb's width, the hum that drifted out like some half-forgotten lullaby, and the way the air turned sharp and cold whenever you stood near it, as though the ward itself was holding its breath to see if you'd break the rule. Miro noticed my staring and shook his head, muttering, "You ever hold a box turtle? It hides. You want it out, you wait, you don't knock." But his warning only stoked the fire in me because I couldn't help wondering what exactly was hiding inside, and if maybe Hallie was in there, folded into that humming darkness. Later that night, while Miro handled meds in Ward C, I slipped back to the corridor, my boots echoing too loudly against the tile, every sound amplified by the building's attention. And when I reached E7, the gap was perfect, thumbs width polite as always, but I leaned closer anyway, lowering my voice to the floor so it wouldn't count as speaking aloud, and whispered Hallie's name like a confession. I shouldn't have done it, but I needed to know what, and when I pulled back, the humming from inside changed, rising in pitch, carrying fragments of syllables that burrowed under my ribs, and though I couldn't make out the words, I felt them vibrating in my chest as if whatever was inside wasn't speaking to my ears, but directly to my blood. My first instinct was to step away, but instead I lingered, listening. And that was when the intercom crackled to life with a static so sharp it made my teeth ache, whispering my name in that broken, affectionate tone again. And reflex had me whispering, "All accounted for," though my voice sounded hollow, like it belonged to someone else. I should have walked away, but just inside the gap, on the floor, lay a folded square of black muslin, small as a handkerchief, and when I reached through the slit to grab it, the cloth was damp, heavier than fabric should ever feel, like a pocket full of rain. And as I unfolded it, frost-like letters bloomed across the weave. "Remember, feed, do not name." The words glowing faintly as if lit from within. My stomach lurched, and for a second I thought I saw a reflection stitched into the fibers. Hallie's pale face, lips moving, eyes locked on mine, before it faded back into darkness, leaving me shaking. I pressed the square to the nearest observation mirror, and to my horror, it clung there without tape, as though it wanted that place. And when Miro caught me, he smacked it away, snarling, "We don't use extras, every piece is counted." But I could tell by his trembling hands that he'd seen the same thing before, maybe even lost someone to it. "What did you see?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. But he only muttered, "You don't want the answer," and walked away, leaving me with more questions than I could carry. Silence that night was worse than usual, the air turning so still that even the shadows seemed to stop moving. And when the gurney wheels came, squealing faintly, they didn't roll past this time. They stopped in the middle of the hall, right outside E7, and the silence thickened until my chest ached from holding my breath. Then a voice rose, softer than a sigh, whispering not my name, but Hallie's, stretching it into a plea, and my mouth almost betrayed me, almost called back. But I remembered the 7th rule I'd written myself on the blank line of my card. Never call what's missing by its name, call it by its job. And I forced out "Charge Nurse" instead, and the wheel squeaked once more before rolling away into the dark, leaving behind a smell like burnt iron and spoiled apples. When the silence lifted, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had given something permission, that by speaking that title, I had opened a new door that wasn't printed on any map. And when we finished our rounds, I slid my badge into the salt tray with trembling hands, watching the crystals blush faintly pink again, fizzing like carbonation, and Miro gave me the same flat order, "Stay." But this time, I didn't resist because I already knew that if I left early, if I let my curiosity follow me out of the building, the ward wouldn't just own me during the night shift, it would follow me home.
By the 7th night, I'd already broken the most important promise I'd made to myself. Not to get involved, not to poke too hard at things I didn't understand. But once the ward gets its claws in you, there's no such thing as distance. And that night, management announced a systems audit for sublevel E, their sanitized way of saying something had broken in a way the ward didn't forgive. And they needed warm bodies to walk into it. They chose me, 2 maintenance techs with tool belts that jingled like rosaries, and Dr. Ven, a physician whose smile was famous for never reaching her eyes. And the moment she appeared, I knew she wasn't here to heal anyone. She was here to take notes on what couldn't be explained. Escort duty sounded official, but in reality it meant one thing. If the ward tried to bargain, I was the one it would speak through. And as we descended into the utility corridors behind E-Ward, the pipes above us rattled like bones in a giant's throat, the air thick with damp stone and something metallic that left a taste on my tongue like pennies. The first camera flickered as we passed beneath, its screen upstairs nerd out going black, and Dr. Ven only scribbled in her notebook as if outages were part of the schedule, but I could feel the hairs on my arms stand straight, warning me the building had noticed. Halfway through the corridor, the intercom cleared its throat in a long, deliberate hiss, and I recited the line automatically. "All accounted for," while Dr. Ven murmured, "For now," under her breath, the kind of slip you only make if you've been here long enough to know the rules are thin ice. When we reached E7, my gut turned inside out, because the door wasn't thumb-width polite anymore. It had been forced open wide enough to wedge a rubber chalk between the frame and the jamb, the gap yawning like an uninvited smile. And I froze, certain that if I steered too long, something inside would stare back. But Dr. Ven crouched calmly, holding a strip of paper to the opening, watching it tremble in an invisible draft, her face cold as she muttered measurements to the text. The paper twitched once, then twice, as if something was breathing it in, and before anyone could react, the wedge thudded out of place and the door snapped shut to the proper thumb width on its own. polite again, almost smug. The techs cursed under their breath, but the doctor's hand trembled when she wrote her note, portraying that she hadn't expected the ward to correct itself. The rest of the round blurred, our steps muted, my nerves raw, until silence fell like a dropped curtain at 2 o'clock sharp, pulling every sound into itself. And as we scrambled to cover mirrors with muslin, the small block square I'd found the night before burned warm in my pocket, begging me to use it. So I pressed it to the last uncovered observation glass, and words shimmered faintly in the weave. "Don't close the mouth," letters glowing like embers. And without meaning to, I read them out loud under my breath, and Dr. Venn snapped her head toward me, her voice sharp as a scalpel. "What mouth?" But before I could answer, the air around us shuddered, cutlery rattling, bone deep. And down the hall, bed 5's tray slid across the floor by itself, clattering like teeth chattering in the cold. The techs pressed their backs to the wall as the gurney wheels squeaked into existence, rolling nearer with no driver, no patient, nothing visible but their sound. An instinct made me order, "Against the wall," as if I had any authority. And we flattened ourselves while the invisible cart passed, its breath brushing the backs of our necks like a hand testing for fever. And I swear it paused behind me long enough to inhale, as though deciding if I was worth swallowing whole. And in that frozen second, I almost said Hallie's name, but I remembered my own scratched-in rule and forced out, "Charge nurse," the words tasting like ash in my mouth. And the thing rolled on, fading into silence, leaving only the stench of scorched meat and rotten apples. When the half hour ended, the ducks sighed with relief and the lights flared back to life. But no one spoke of what we saw. Dr. Venn only ripped a page from her notebook and stuffed it into her pocket like a charm, refusing to share the words with anyone else. And I hated her for it, because it meant she was keeping knowledge that could save or damn us. At shift's end, I dropped my badge into the salt tray and the crystals fizzed a deep red. Not pink this time, but crimson, the color of a wound. And Miro didn't even need to say it. Stay, because I already knew if I stepped outside before dawn, the ward would follow me into the open air. And I couldn't stop thinking that maybe it already had, because my pocket still pulsed faintly where the muslin square rested, beating like a second heart that didn't belong to me.
By the 8th night, I knew I was going to do it, though I couldn't have explained why to anyone else. Because once you spend enough time inside Graven Hollow, the rules stop feeling like protection and start feeling like bait. Breadcrumbs leading you to a truth no one survives knowing. And I was tired of feeling like a mouse. I waited until Rounds pulled Miro toward B ward with his medcart, his humming low and distracted, and I slipped away into sublevel E with nothing but the black muslin square burning a hole in my pocket and the laminated card clutched in my fist, my thumb tracing the rules like scripture, as if reading them could buy me forgiveness later. When I reached E7, the door was thumb width polite, the kind of precision that felt smug now, like the ward was daring me to misbehave. And for the first time, I didn't hesitate. I crouched, put my eye to the slit, and whispered into the cold air, "I won't close you, but I won't climb in either," my breath fogging against the wood. And what came back wasn't sound so much as pressure, a pulse in the air like something vast shifting in the dark, a tide brushing against the edge of shore. The gap widened of its own will, fraction by fraction, polite no longer, but curious, and the cold air that rushed out smelled of apples rotting under snow, sweet and spoiled, and I leaned closer until I could taste metal on my tongue. Inside, there was no floor, no bed, no patient, just darkness that wasn't absence but presence, like staring into water so deep it swallows light. And I should have pulled back then, but instead I whispered, "All accounted for," not to the intercom but to the black itself, as if it needed to hear the lie. And in response, the humming shifted into something like words, syllables scraping against my bones, too broken to understand but too human to ignore. And when my flashlight beam slipped across the gap, it didn't hit wall or ceiling. It caught the curve of something pale and massive, moving just out of range, sliding across the stone like a newborn learning to crawl. And the sight of it nearly ripped a scream out of me, but I clamped my teeth down hard until blood filled my mouth. Shaking, I pulled the muslin square from my pocket and placed it on the floor between me and the door, and almost instantly words stitched themselves across the fabric in frost-bright lines. Remember, feed, do not name. And I knew without doubt that the cloth had been waiting for this moment, that I had become its courier. And before I could decide what to do, the darkness pressed against the door, testing it, and for a heartbeat I felt the weight of a hand on mine through the wood, calloused, familiar, impossibly human. And I whispered, "Charge nurse," because if I said Holly's name, I knew it would become permanent.
and the hand pressed once, firm and grateful, before withdrawing into the block. The intercom hissed above me then, speaking not in static this time, but in my father's voice, the exact cadence he'd used the night before he died, whispering my nickname, "Kenny, come home." And every nerve in me begged to answer, to break the rule, to lean into the comfort, but I kept my eyes fixed on the muslin as it pulsed warm and repeated the phrase I'd just spoken, "Charge nurse," echoing me like a charm, and the intercom cut off with a sound like teeth snapping shut. The door sighed then, closing just slightly until the gap was once again thumbed with polite, as though nothing had happened, and I staggered back, my chest heaving, sweat dripping into my eyes, but the square on the floor clung stubbornly to the tile, its words slowly fading until only one remained legible, "Feed." And I understood in that moment that Bed 5's trays weren't meals for a patient, they were offerings to the mouth in E7, tithes to keep it from hungering for us instead. I stumbled through the rest of the shift like a man drunk, saying the rules under my breath as my knees threatened to buckle, and when silence came, the wheels squeaked but didn't approach, as though whatever pushed them had already fed. And I knew it was because I had made the offering. I had spoken to it. I had been acknowledged. By dawn, my hands were shaking so hard I could barely slide my badge into the salt tray, and when the crystals blushed deep pink again, Mira only looked at me once, his eyes full of something between pity and accusation, and said, "Now it knows you." And I realized with a shudder that he wasn't talking about the ward anymore. He was talking about the thing inside E7, the thing that had touched my hand and let me walk away.
By the 9th night, sleep had become a stranger to me. Every dream filled with that humming lullaby bleeding through E7's door. Each note tugging me closer. And when I woke drenched in sweat, I knew I couldn't go on pretending I was just an orderly following rules. I was already tangled in something older and hungrier than the ward itself. And so I made a choice that night, reckless and deliberate. If the thing behind that door wanted to be fed, I would feed it more than soup and apple slices. I would give it proof I understood its hunger. I carried the ceremonial tray as usual, but instead of leaving it outside Bed 5, I swapped the contents with stolen rations from Ward C. Bread crusts, stale crackers, even an orange had pocketed from the staff lounge. And when I placed it before E7, I knocked twice, heart hammering, and whispered, "Feed," my breath fogging in the cold draft. The tray shuddered against the tile as though invisible fingers hooked it, and then it slid under the door with a scrape that made my teeth ache, vanishing into the dark. And what came back wasn't silence, but the sound of chewing, wet and deliberate, punctuated by low murmurs that weren't quite language, but close enough to make my skin crawl. And when the noises stopped, the tray returned, scraped back into the hall, the bowl emptied, and the orange peel arranged into a spiral that looked eerily like a thumbprint. I should have run then, but instead I crouched and pressed the black muslin square to the tray, watching as faint letters bloomed across the fabric again. More. And the instant I read it aloud under my breath, the intercom clicked on, whispering, "Hungry," not in my name this time, but in Hallie's voice, stretched and strained as though it was being pulled apart syllable by syllable. Rage and guilt collided in me. I had failed her, abandoned her, and now something was using her voice as bait, and I almost screamed her name before my own rule flashed in my head like a neon sign. Never call what's missing by its name, call it by its job. So I hissed, "Charge nurse," instead. And the intercom sighed, shutting off with a hiss like water steaming on a skillet. I staggered back and almost collided with Miro, who had been trailing me silently, his eyes sunken and knowing. And instead of scolding me, he only said, "Now you've made a promise." And his words hit me harder than any slap, because in my gut I knew he was right. I had broken a rule in order to keep another, and the thing inside E7 had recognized the trade. Silence came down like a guillotine, cutting every sound, and this time the wheels didn't squeak at all, which should have been comforting but wasn't, because their absence meant something worse. The attention of the ward had shifted, waiting, watching to see if I would fulfill the bargain I had made. The lights flickered once, and in the brief stroke, I saw shadows moving beneath the doors of every patient room, shapes too large to belong to the fragile bodies inside, and then gone, like they'd only stepped forward to acknowledge me. I pressed my back to the wall, muttering the rules over and over, the words now less like protections and more like prayers scratched into skin. And when silence lifted, the ductwork groaned like it was disappointed. After rounds, I found myself drawn back to E7, kneeling at the door, whispering into the gap, "I gave you more. Now tell me what you are." But only the humming answered, rising and falling in patterns that felt like laughter. I dropped my badge into the salt tray at dawn and watched the crystals fizz crimson again, the color richer than before. And I realized the tray wasn't testing me anymore. It was warning me. The salt knew I was marked, that the thing in E7 had my scent, and that I only had two choices left: to feed it until it was sated, or to starve it and watch it come find me instead.
I knew the 10th night would take something from me. I just didn't know what name it would wear when it left. And by the time I clocked in, the card of rules in my pocket felt less like policy and more like a will I hadn't signed. I found Miro in the lounge, staring at a cold cup of coffee, like it might eventually answer him. And he didn't bother with the usual chant, just said, if you feed a mouth long enough, it starts asking for a bite with a heartbeat. And then he handed me Bed 5's tray like he was passing down a family curse. I walked the corridor alone, the ward listening with that patient hunger I'd grown to recognize. And when I reached E7, the door was already thumb-width polite, a perfect oval of dark, and the muslin square in my pocket warmed like a living thing. I set the tray down and knocked twice, but instead of turning away, I stayed kneeling and whispered, "I kept my promise, now keep yours." Not sure what promise I was trying to force into existence until the tray slid under without a sound, swallowed whole by shadow. The intercom answered me in my father's voice first, then Hallie's, then voices I didn't recognize, laced together like a rope, breathing a single word, hungry. And I almost said her name, almost shattered every rule, but what came next stopped me cold. The tray scraped back into the hall with a precision that felt human, and arranged on it, pressed into the condensation on the bowl, was a print, a thumbprint, deep and whorled, too neat to be an accident. I knew that print without needing proof, because I'd seen it bloom on the muslin, and somewhere in me something unclenched, not exactly relief, more like being given an answer you didn't want that still steadied your feet. "Charge nurse," I said softly to the door, and the dark breathed once in a rhythm that matched mine, then stilled. I should have walked away, declared victory over nothing, but curiosity had me by the throat, and the part of me that had lived here too long understood the truth. You can't keep a mouth polite unless you feed it the shape of what it asks for. So I broke a rule to keep the rest, stole half the rations from Ward C, more from the staff ridge, slipped pills I knew were sugar into the med count so no one missed them. And when silence fell, it didn't slam down so much as settle like a heavy coat over wet shoulders. The gurney wheels didn't squeak at all. Instead, the ward exhaled a breath that smelled like old apples and warmed metal. And in the dead center of that hush came the softest tap on the other side of E7. Once, twice, the exact pattern I'd been warned never to answer at the glass. But this wasn't glass. This was the door. And I was already kneeling with my hand pressed flat to the wood. I lifted the muslin square, now hot as a fever, and held it there, and words stitched themselves across the weave. Not frostbite this time, but dark, sunken. Keep the door polite. Do not name. Feed the agreement. And then fainter still, a line that felt like a whisper caught in the seam of the world. You are being counted. The intercom clicked like a tongue against teeth, and the ward asked the question it had been circling for nights. Kenny. Not a trick of static anymore, but the exact sound of my mother asking if I was finished playing outside. And I understood what the mouth wanted. My name, not my body. If I gave it that, it could use me forever, call me down whichever corridor needed a warm voice. I swallowed the reflex and said the only phrase I had left, the one that worked because it was untrue in the way bargains adore. All accounted for. And the door's breath fell into step with mine again. I don't know what made me do it next, only that it felt like the last coin in my pocket. I slid the muslin under the door until the cloth caught on something, and I held the edge with 2 fingers. For 3 heartbeats, nothing. And then a hand closed over the other side. Warm, calloused, unmistakably human, pressing once, twice, not asking to be pulled through, but thanking me for not trying. I pulled the square back, and there in the fabric's weave, a peerless smudge, shaped like a thumb with a faint scar through it. the same ridge I'd seen on Hallie's glove when she tightened the drug drawer on my first night. And something in my chest broke and set itself properly at the same time. I covered the observation mirrors like a man laying coins on eyelids, whispering apologies I knew the ward didn't need. And when silence lifted, Dr. Venn appeared at the end of the corridor with her clipboard, and a smile that finally reached her eyes because it wasn't a smile at all, but a baring of teeth. "We'll be sealing E7, she announced like we were voting on paint colors, and the building laughed in the ducts, a soft, rustling sound that made the hairs on my arms rise. Miro said nothing, just looked at me, and I knew this was the moment I would either lose or keep what little balance we'd managed. I stood in front of E7, palms out, and spoke in the language the ward respected. Rules. Rule 7. When something is missing, do not hunt it by its name. Feed it by its hunger. Keep the door polite. Keep the mirror covered. Keep count. If you must break a rule to keep another, choose the one that feeds the mouth and starves the names. And I pressed my badge into the salt tray at the exit desk without leaving my spot, watching the crystals blush from pink to clear, then back again, as if deciding, and settle on a pale rose. That meant stay. The doctor tried her key card on the emergency shutter. The mechanism coughed and died like a choked bird. Self-correcting, she muttered, but I heard fear tunnel through the clinical. Dawn came like it always does, grudging and gray, and I sat in the lounge writing the 7th rule in permanent marker on a dozen spare cards, slipping them into pockets, taping them to the inside of lockers, hiding them the way sailors hide charms in the beams of a ship. 3 days later, Hallie returned, hair shorter, voice smaller, eyes the same. No one said her name. She didn't offer it. She watched me slide the black square over the observation mirror and pressed her thumb into the cloth. The print matched. All accounted for, she said, and the building let the words be true. I still work nights, still walk that corridor with my heart beating like a metronome set one notch too fast, still listen for wheels that may or may not be there, and every shift I stop at E7 and put my hand flat on the wood and breathe until the breathing on the other side matches mine. Sometimes the intercom asks my nickname, and I feed it the lie. Sometimes Bed 5's tray returns arranged into shapes that mean we are understood. And on rare nights, when the salt turns pink and stays that way, I lock the lounge and wait with Miro until the day staff arrives, both of us not speaking the names we know, both of us counting under our breath. I used to think the rules were a cage. Now I know they are teeth. And if you ever find yourself on a night shift where the silence has a taste and the mirrors remember you, keep your door polite, keep your names to yourself, and bring something sweet for the mouth, because hunger is patient and it always knows how to spell you.
So that was my story. And maybe now you understand why I keep my badge in salt, why I never say a name after 2 in the morning, and why I always carry something sweet in my pocket. Some rules don't just protect us, they protect the world from what waits in the dark. And if you ever find yourself walking the halls of a psychiatric ward at night, remember this: silence isn't empty, it's listening. If you enjoyed tonight's story, check out more terrifying tales right here on Echoes After Midnight. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss what waits for you after midnight.